No matter the era, the Ultimate Warrior has been one of professional wrestling's most polarizing stars. Post-mortem today, fans either appreciate what the Warrior character represented, or they despise who Warrior the person was. In his extensive retirement years, supporters remembered the good times, while critics loathed that somebody of his skill level received that golden push. And in Warrior's heyday, fans either couldn't get enough of the rope shaking, phrase turning, huffing and snarling exploits of their face-painted anti-hero, or they ridiculed Warrior for precisely those reasons. What an even staunch hater cannot deny is that Warrior did have a large fan following, and that he was a major star in professional wrestling. At the turn of the 90s, the Ultimate Warrior became the top champion in the top wrestling organization on the planet, and seemed to have enough arena cheers and merchandise metrics to back up that push. But while the positive side of Warrior's legacy casts him as a staunchy mainstay in the late Hulkamania era, the truth is that Warrior's time at the top of the WWF was shorter than the career epitaph sometimes indicates. And once the slide commenced, Warrior spent the rest of his time between the ropes looking to recapture that lost magic, a lightning in a bottle sense of simpatico with the pro wrestling zeitgeist, to no avail. The Ultimate Warrior was undoubtedly a star wrestler, but one whose decline began far sooner than fans of all walks may have realized. I'm Ross Tweddle from Cultaholic Wrestling, and this is the rise and fall of the Ultimate Warrior. Like many wrestlers of his day, the man formerly known as James Bryan Hellwig found a gateway into professional wrestling through an adjacent sport, in this case, bodybuilding. In the early to mid-80s, Hellwig placed prominently in collegiate and other amateur bodybuilding competitions, even winning the crown of Mr. Georgia in 1984. His pursuits in the sport led Hellwig to California, where in 1985 he fell in with a group of bodybuilders that were entering the professional wrestling business. Though wrestling had not previously been on Hellwig's radar, he jumped at the opportunity. With these other men, Hellwig received training from veteran wrestler Red Bastien and young California-based talent agent Rick Bassman. This group of muscle-bound wrestling prospects was known as Power Team USA, though Hellwig and one of the other members would be the only ones that put a dent in the wrestling business. In November of 1985, Hellwig wrestled his first match, a tag team bout with his fellow Power Team member. Known collectively as the Freedom Fighters, Hellwig took on the name Justice, while partner Steve Borden wrestled as Flash. The first stop for the Freedom Fighters was Memphis's Continental Territory. By most accounts, Flash and Justice were completely out of their league, just a couple of talentless jocks, heavy on muscle and low on actual skill. While cosmetic looks could take you a long way in an industry that was favoring a superstar look more and more, the two would still need to pick up seasoning. Fans in Memphis were initially cool on the lumbering duo, so Flash and Justice were turned heel before leaving the territory shortly thereafter. Their next stop was Bill Watts' Mid-South group, where the Freedom Fighters became the Blade Runners, the latest in a pretty sizable line of Road Warrior ripoffs, trying to cash in on the mayhem and dystopia that Animal and Hawk were successfully cultivating. This go-around, Hellwig changed his stage name to Rock, while Borden settled upon a handle that he'd get decades of use out of: Sting. This was but another brief chapter in Hellwig's career, however, as he left the territory by mid-86, disbanding the Blade Runners and leaving Sting behind. Whereas Sting was well regarded by his peers and had demonstrated an increased aptitude for wrestling, Hellwig was hampered by a reported negative reputation and just wasn't grasping wrestling like Sting was. Shortly after departing Mid-South, Hellwig crossed over into the Von Erich family's World Class in Dallas, where he'd take on his third gimmick in less than 7 months. This time, Hellwig became the Dingo Warrior, an explosive force in tribal war paint that few opponents could capably contain. Managed by Gary Hart and Lady Percival Pringle, bloody Paul Bearer by the way, the Warrior was first categorized as a heel, though a face turn was certainly inevitable. While he was still quite unpolished, Warrior had developed just enough stage presence to where audiences were charmed by his combustible madness. Even as a heel in Dallas, the Warrior had his fans, and that turn would be coming. Indeed, Warrior fell out with Pringle's stable and became a popular babyface star in the region. Warrior went on to win World Class's Texas Heavyweight title in early 1987, but it wouldn't be a long reign. That's because pro wrestling's biggest organization was bringing Warrior in to join their staggering parade of testosterone. Still using the Dingo Warrior handle, Hellwig entered the WWF in June of 1987. Though that wasn't immediately clear to the wider Federation audience. The WWF office knew they were in a curious spot with Warrior, as he had the look and presence of a star, but was still clumsy and imperfect bell to bell. As was the case with the chiseled and athletic Tom McGee, the WWF was content to let Warrior work the house show circuit, honing his craft before giving him anything resembling a push on television. In other words, Warrior was a project, one that Vince McMahon and others felt would pay off big with enough development. And so Warrior went, wrestling away from the TV cameras in matches with Terry Gibbs, Barry Horowitz, Jose Estrada, and Steve Lombardi, not yet the Brooklyn Brawler. While that was the idea, fans at the arena shows kind of forced McMahon's hand. Response for Warrior was enormous, far greater than expectations. The WWF wanted to ride the momentum, so they put Warrior on television earlier than planned, and he started working TV tapings in the autumn of 1987. By this time, the Dingo was scrubbed from his name. Hellwig was henceforth known as the Ultimate Warrior. This warrior received the consummate beginner's push, chewing up and spitting out a steady diet of enhancement talents. Like most of his contemporaries, Warrior's squash wins were brief encounters, rarely passing the 2-minute mark. Though in Warrior's case, that was probably for the best. Actually, the shorter matches benefited Warrior in a different way. In some regards, Warrior was perfect for the Saturday morning squash match formula. He'd arrive, shake the ropes, beat his tits, race around the ring in an aggressive stupor, and then cut down the poor bastard across the ring with a slew of strikes and slams. Warrior finished his hapless foes with a gorilla press slam, followed by a running splash, wrapping up the beatings in near record time. WWF fans were catching on to the way of the Warrior. There was nothing methodical about Warrior's brand of onslaught because Jim Hellwig wasn't paid by the hour. It wasn't just the particular match presentation that made Warrior stand out. He also turned more than a few heads with his style of promo. While every Ultimate Warrior promo qualifies as unique, it is fair to say that if you've seen one, you know how the rest go. As if entering a trance, Warrior would rant and rave about the gods and the demons, the trials of humanity, the challenges of the Warrior Code, and all of the forms of psycho babble, all the while tossing in a high volume of non sequiturs in a death metal growl. It's fair to say that if you can inspire people to try and recreate your own promos in the bathroom mirror, even just to crack oneself up, you've probably gotten through to them to some degree. Between those definitive squash wins and insane rants, not to mention the hard-driving theme song that got your blood a-pumping, the Ultimate Warrior found himself becoming pro wrestling's next big superstar. In the heavily muscled late 80s, Warrior built upon his beefy foundation with a spellbinding soundtrack. He was a face-painted blur, a hearty dose of Technicolor chaos that brought exciting distortion to an already colourful program. And fans were clamouring for more Warrior. By early 1988, Warrior began tussling with members of the Heenan family, clashing with Harley Race and Hercules on TV and throughout the house show circuit. Warrior's first pay-per-view outing was a victory over Hercules at WrestleMania 4. Bobby Heenan himself ended up a Warrior victim, coming out on the losing end of matches where the loser had to don a weasel suit. But while Heenan's humiliation was a nice prize, actual gold would find its way to the Warrior before long. By the summer of 1988, McMahon had decided that Warrior was going to be the heir apparent to Hulk Hogan's mantle. Though not presently the WWF champion, Hogan would reclaim that crown in 1989 from Randy Savage, and reassume his duties as the face of the WWF. That face was bound to develop cracks over time, and 35-year-old Hogan was already eyeing opportunities away from the ring. It was only a matter of time before McMahon would have to have the new Hogan ready to go. Warrior had just turned 29, and it was time to fit him with a belt. Plans for the 1988 SummerSlam in New York included Intercontinental Champion the Honky Tonk Man defending his belt against Brutus the Barber Beefcake. To this point, Honky was 15 months deep into his reign, a record that will likely stand the rest of eternity. By hook or by crook, the Elvis impersonator always managed to retain his title against whatever valiant challenger stepped up to the plate. And WWF fans, they lived for the day that somebody could finally cut through all the BS and bring the Honky Tonk Man's reign to its bitter end. Beefcake seemed like a good choice, but he wasn't going to get that shot at SummerSlam after all. On WWF Superstars during SummerSlam weekend, Beefcake was attacked by Outlaw Ron Bass. who used the spurs from his cowboy boot to cut up Beefcake's forehead in a shockingly bloody angle for kid-friendly WWF television. It was explained at SummerSlam that Beefcake would not be able to wrestle because of the attack, leaving Honky without an opponent. The champion made his entrance that night inside Madison Square Garden, joined by manager Jimmy Hart. The two were all smiles when Honky gleefully demanded an opponent, any opponent, saying he didn't care who it was. Famous last words, as seconds later, the Warrior's music thudded throughout the garden. As the cheers grew in volume, Warrior flew up the aisle in an absolute frenzy. Honky didn't even have time to get out of his jumpsuit, as Warrior mauled him without second thought. Inside of 30 seconds, Warrior did what all other babyface heroes had failed to do since June of 1987, crush Honky and take away his Intercontinental title. The genius of it was that by winning the way Warrior did, he further separated himself from the pack. The Savages and Duggans and Beefcakes and Steamboats of the world were all too cautious, too wary of Honky's penchant for cheating and tricks. They could out-wrestle Honky, but they tried to do so carefully, mindful of the screwiness. Warrior cut out all of those mind screws and just beat Honky to death before he even had a chance to cheat. Now that's ring psychology. Winning the Intercontinental title seemed to confirm what everybody had already figured out, that the Ultimate Warrior was a phenomenon, an unrestrained force of nature with room to continue his galaxial ascent. Thus, Warrior loaded that spaceship with the rocket fuel and continued his ascent to new heights. He fended off Honky in subsequent IC title matches. At that year's Survivor Series, Warrior was his team's sole survivor, defeating Ron Bass and Greg Valentine in the end. More space in the monthly merchandise catalogue was allocated to Warrior clothing and assorted novelties. While the fans couldn't get enough of the Ultimate Warrior, it was fair to say that Warrior's in-ring work was still not as acceptable as it could be. If Warrior was going to be a main event player, he'd have to hold up his end in a match that went longer than 5 minutes. And so, 1989 was spent helping Warrior level up his ring work. When Savage turned heel earlier in the year, Warrior was programmed against him in champion versus champion matches throughout the house show circuit. After all, Savage makes everyone better. Warrior found a highly compatible opponent on TV in ravishing Rick Rude, with whom Warrior brawled during an unconventional posing contest at the 1989 Royal Rumble. The two were set across the ring from one another at WrestleMania 5, in what turned out to be Warrior's best match to that point. The match ended in an upset, as Rude's manager Heenan tripped the champion on a suplex into the ring and held Warrior's foot down, while Rude won with a misbegotten pinfall. The good news was that Warrior looked pretty good in a 10-minute match. The bad news was that Warrior could still be clumsy, as seen afterwards when he gave Heenan a gorilla press as payback, and dropped him very awkwardly, causing the ailing manager to further mess up his neck and his back. The loss to Rude was just an excuse for Warrior to continue working with him. Throughout the summer months, Warrior chased Rude throughout the house show loops before finally doing him at the 1989 SummerSlam in an even better encounter than their WrestleMania match. This one went a shade over 16 minutes. Warrior was now a two-time Intercontinental Champion, and the fans were still with him. The next step of the Build-A-Champion process was to allow Warrior to do something that, in the accepted WWF canon, only one special individual had ever done before: slam Andre the Giant. Though Andre's well-being was greatly hampered by the end of the 80s, he was still donning the singlet and boots for very short matches. After Warrior vanquished Rude, Heenan dispatched Andre to bring the Intercontinental title back to the Heenan family. In theory, this was Warrior's biggest test to date, trying to slay a giant that only Hulk Hogan, again WWF canon here, had ever felled before. Thus, this would be a vital component to Warrior's growing legend. What followed was a series of house matches where Andre insisted on losing very quickly, largely due to a personal distaste for Warrior, whom he felt didn't appreciate the push he was given. It wasn't all that uncommon to see Andre job out to Warrior in under 30 seconds in any given American city. Along the way, Andre did surrender himself to body slams from the Warrior, revealing that the Intercontinental Champion was just as powerful as Hogan, by now once more the world champion. At the 1989 Survivor Series, the match pitting Warrior and Andre's teams against each other went on last, in what some feel was a glimpse at how pay-per-view would look, ending with Warrior's music instead of Hogan's. Speaking of Hogan, at the turn of the decade, the transition process for the WWF main event began in earnest. The 1990 Royal Rumble match featured one of the seminal scenes of its time: number 21 entrant Warrior and 25 entrant Hogan cleaning house, sending getting all the relative fodder out of the ring. Then, after the last of the driftwood have been cleared out, the World and Intercontinental Champions both realized they were the only two men standing in the ring. The crowd in the Orlando arena began buzzing. This was the first time that they, or anybody else, had seen Warrior and Hogan occupy the same space. And for the two beloved heavyweights, the gravity wasn't lost on them either. What followed was a very brief skirmish that resulted in a double down. But the smart money was that it wouldn't be the only Hogan-Warrior clash we'd ever see. Indeed, we'd soon learn that Hogan vs. Warrior would be the main event of WrestleMania 6, before a crowd of 60,000 at the new Toronto Sky Dome. And it was also decreed that both championships would be on the line. Those on the inside and those with an ear to the ground knew in advance that the so-termed Ultimate Challenge would end with Warrior handing Hogan his first clean pinfall loss in 9 years, and becoming the new face of the World Wrestling Federation. With Pat Patterson acting as architect, Hogan and Warrior pieced together a 20-plus minute epic that would serve to stand for future main events of its type. The fans in Toronto were anticipating an era-defining battle, and the WWF was going to give them one. A reported crowd of 67,000 plus was split in who they favoured. Half went for the time-tested hero of yore, others for the clear successor. All the responses combined to soundtrack perhaps the most intense, most unpredictable main event in WWF history to that point. And the two wrestlers pulled it off. Hogan caught the spots while Warrior capably followed, and each dramatic beat built on the previous one. The only flaw was a totally gassed Warrior nearly keeling over in the final stage, but he kept it together long enough to carry out the finishing sequence. After Hogan barraged Warrior with 3 punches and the big boot, the WWF champion attempted the big leg drop, only for Warrior to move away. As Hogan lay stunned, Warrior took advantage with the big splash, pinning the Hulkster in the center of the ring. The Ultimate Warrior had done it. Nobody could honestly beat Hogan, but Warrior just did. The emotional torch-passing moment followed. Hogan handed over the Winged Eagle belt and endorsed his conqueror, before riding off on the motorized ring cart, while Warrior celebrated beneath a hail of pyro, holding both men's singles titles aloft. The Ultimate Warrior was to be the man of the 90s, the brasher, more kick-ass update to the safer Hulkamania that preceded it. Hulk ruled the 80s, and now Warrior was set to throttle the 90s. Except it didn't quite work out that way. For a number of reasons, Warrior just couldn't get out of the Hogan shadow. When Randy Savage took over as champion in 1988, he may not have outsized Hogan, but many fans accepted him as a worthy title holder. And business remained strong with the Macho Man holding the big belt. The same couldn't be said for Warrior. For much of the rest of 1990, WWF's metrics began sagging. Before year's end, McMahon and company were making arrangements to reinstate the aging Hogan as a #1 once more. So what happened? Well, some believe that Hogan's subtleties undermined Warrior at WrestleMania 6. Between kicking out of the splash at 3.1 and emoting his way through the post-match scene, some felt that Hulk put the spotlight on himself when the moment was supposed to be about Warrior scoring the biggest win of his life. So Hogan's shadow continued looming, even when he took a sabbatical during the spring and early summer. Hulk was written out following a storyline attack by Earthquake, and he became the subject of a letter-writing campaign that targeted well fans wanting to send well wishes to their hero. The campaign was incessantly promoted during the early summer of 1990, so even when Hogan was gone, he was still treated like a big deal. But you can't lay it all at Hogan's feet. There was also the fact that Warrior didn't have a lot of strong challengers. Mr. Perfect and Rick Rude had already lost to Warrior, and there weren't any other viable threats at the time that could be fed to the Warrior. When Hogan was champ, there seemed to be sturdy new challengers popping up all the time. On the other hand, Warrior mostly got retreads. Also, part of the problem was the Warrior character. While the snarling maniac that gruntled in riddles like some sort of post-apocalyptic Jim Morrison was pretty cool in his own right, he was by no means a replacement for what Hogan represented. See, Hogan had humanity. Weird thing to say these days, but we'll roll with it. He could exist in real-life situations, and he was somewhat relatable. Sure, Hogan could be pretty deluded and over the top in his promos, but he also had the range to pull it back and exist in the real world. Warrior hadn't demonstrated that. His WrestleMania 6 soliloquies alone, especially the one where he talks about death and turbulence abroad, Hogan's personal aircraft or something, revealed a man less superhero and more twisted loner. Hogan was Superman, but Warrior was Batman, if Batman had his dialogue written by a sleep-deprived English lit student. The WWF understood this was a problem, and they tried to humanize Warrior, whether by having him bring a young Warrior fan out of the crowd for a segment, or briefly giving him a minimalist face paint design that revealed more of his face, or by booking him for more talk show appearances. No matter the effort, business with Warrior on top remained down. With Hogan back in the fold by the end of the summer, the WWF set up their plan for 1991. They would have Warrior drop the title at the Royal Rumble to a now anti-American Sergeant Slaughter, and use Slaughter to transition the belt back to Hogan at WrestleMania 7. All while cashing in on the rising tensions in the Persian Gulf, Warrior did the honors as asked, and moved on to a feud with Savage. The two would face off in the second biggest match at WrestleMania 7, with the loser being forced to retire. Said loser was to be Savage, who was genuinely looking for a way out of wrestling in 1991. Warrior and Savage's match was one for the ages. A highly dramatic pathos play that culminated in Warrior vanquishing his equally manic foe. Warrior then exited stage left, giving the spotlight to Savage for his emotional reunion with Miss Elizabeth. A classic WrestleMania moment. Amid all the hoopla, Warrior wore a pair of trunks with a curious airbrush detail. On the backside was an image of the WWF Championship, surrounded by the words "means much more than this." There seemed to be a few bitter feelings over how the title reign turned out, but Warrior had other reasons to be bitter, at least in his eyes. In July of 1991, after Warrior had already been advertised to team with Hogan in a 3-on-2 attraction at SummerSlam the next month, Warrior penned a letter to McMahon making monetary demands, as well as demanding special contractual considerations going forward, such as working less days and better cuts of merchandise sales. The implication was that Warrior was willing to stay home until he got what he wanted. Days later, McMahon sent a response, agreeing to all of Warrior's demands, and ended the letter with some warm, squishy, cuddly sentiments that indicated that Warrior was his friend. None of that Hallmark Channel crap was there come the night of SummerSlam, mind you. As soon as Warrior made it back to the locker room following his match participation, he was given a letter written that day by McMahon, informing him that he was suspended indefinitely from the WWF. McMahon added that he only agreed to Warrior's demands to ensure that he worked SummerSlam as advertised, and now that Warrior did that, he could go home and rot for all he cared. 17 months earlier, Warrior was assuming the lead dog position in the WWF, dethroning the unassailable Hogan to become the king of the wrestling world. Now, he was just some face-painted pauper that crossed the boss, and a man whose world title reign flopped at the box office. So much for being Hogan's successor. But Warrior would get another bite at that apple. Hogan's name had publicly been tarnished due to the perceived links between him and steroids. As such, WrestleMania 8 in 1992 was going to be Hogan's swan song for however long. That evening in Indianapolis, Warrior made a surprise return to the WWF, saving Hogan from the clutches of Sid Justice and Papa Shango. It was the second time the Warrior would try to pick up where Hogan left off, 2 years after the failed first attempt. But so much had changed in just 2 years. The WWF was now sagging under the weight of scandal, public scrutiny, and audience erosion. The roster was thinning out, losing a number of old reliables and replacing them with the less skillful remains of a decayed territory system. Next to Savage and Ric Flair, Warrior was the only other individual on the roster that at least had copious experience at the top of a national organization. Undertaker, Bret Hart, and Shawn Michaels would all have their day, but the level of prestige had never been thinner in McMahon's WWF. Not that Warrior's second run was all that prestigious. A mindless feud with Papa Shango resulted in Warrior being afflicted with laughable curses, like the one that saw him puke up applesauce. There was also the fact that this slightly leaner Warrior looked a little too human, and actually prompted long-standing urban legends that this Warrior was a new Warrior because the previous one had died. Aside from a well-executed feud with Savage over the WWF title that played on the two men's paranoia and distrust of one another, Warrior's comeback run wasn't anything special. Business continued sliding towards the abyss, but that's reality for a declining business. When the arrow's pointing downward, a company can do nothing right. While there were rumors that the WWF was interested in transitioning the belt from Savage to Flair to Warrior at one point, McMahon instead decided to pull the trigger on the tireless workhorse Bret Hart. It was a sound decision for a lot of reasons, not least of which being was that the Warrior's WWF days were again numbered. In November of 1992, Warrior and Davey Boy Smith were both fired from the WWF, reportedly for receiving shipments of growth hormone. The WWF's highly necessary anti-drug kick doomed the Warrior, casting him out of the WWF for the second time in 15 months. More and more, the Ultimate Warrior was feeling like an anachronism, a grunting and growling muscle man with metalhead hair and a wasteland paint job trying to persist through the edgier, more detached and sardonic 90s. An Ultimate Warrior implies a final warrior, but times indicated that this warrior was no longer fit for the battlefield of the moment. It was never the same for Warrior after that. The random indie appearances in the mid-90s, going to court with the WWF, the very brief 1996 WWF run that reeked of desperation for both sides, by the way, and the 1998 WCW run that revealed just what happens when one person has just a little too much control over their creative. Let's just say Hogan Warrior 2 wasn't exactly Godfather 2. By the end of the 90s, there were rumors that Warrior was trying to get into ECW, which, well, let's just say that would have been its own video by now. How the hell would that have even worked? And if you laughed at that very notion, then you know what the general stance on Warrior was during the heart of the Attitude Era. By the time the world's youth were jamming to Limp Bizkit and Korn, Warrior was firmly a relic from another time, and mostly a punchline at that. He'd become the wrestling version of hair metal for the standards of the day, largely out of style, representative of another time, mostly silly, and any appreciation toward it by the audience it was intended for was laced with irony. Mind you, this was the man that was supposed to rule the WWF for most of the 90s. He wasn't even there for 30% of the 90s. But as they do in these nostalgia-loving times, attitudes towards Warrior have softened somewhat. I mean, not for the horrible personal views, or for the stories of his attitude, and the fact he made the family of a little warrior who looked to, and I quote, be down to his last few hours and without a hair on his head, wait backstage for the entirety of a live event, only to not meet the poor little guy. Thanks for bringing that to light, by the way, Bret Hart. But people look back fondly on the Warrior for his work on screen and how he does embody the spirit of that specific window in time. After all, the Ultimate Warrior is, for better or worse, a recognizable wrestling archetype. The war-painted protagonist that yells a lot of loud and funny words. Parodies, bootleg action figures, analogues in contemporary productions. So many of them appropriate what Warrior brought to the realm of professional wrestling. Like him or not, he left an indelible mark on the wrestling business. More than a quarter of a century after his last worthwhile match, the Warrior's contributions to wrestling are still felt in a myriad of areas. His impact cannot be denied. And yet, it's also fair to say that in spite of the adulation and appreciation we have for Warrior as a genuine Hall of Fame character, that his peak occurred far earlier than many expected, and perhaps many even realize. Warrior never held any meaningful championship after January of 1991. 1 year into the decade he was supposed to own. That may not be his career epitaph, but damned if it isn't a sobering realization. Bad luck, audience disconnect, perhaps a little subterfuge, and numerous other conflicts began the Warrior's downfall slide extremely prematurely. What was supposed to be the start of the next phase of pro wrestling evolution ended being the apex of a celebration that was already in the process of folding the tent. The Ultimate Warrior may have had the strangest career arc of any wrestler that's best remembered for being a top guy in the WWE. His peak was shorter than we tend to realize, and yet he's so unforgettable that it feels like he was on top forever.